This is our last presentation of the day, but I'm very excited about this. We have one of the leading experts in underwater bioacoustics to give a presentation to you as finishing up our Whalefest Monterey symposium. So we're very happy that he's here, and I want to give a little intro for him before he gets started, but I'll let him kind of speak for himself and his expertise and his knowledge and the work that he does and some of the questions that he's trying to answer. But he has over 25 years of experience studying how marine mammals use sound, how they can be harmed by human noises, and what we can do to reduce noise impacts. His talk will feature California whale voices, what we've learned about using advanced sensor technologies, and how this science is helping us learn how to better protect them. Please welcome Dr. Brandon Southall.
Thank you guys for sticking around, and hopefully I can share some interesting things with you. I kind of come at this issue from a bunch of different perspectives, and I'm actually going to just kind of go to this slide because I'm gonna try to make a little bit of a point. I'm new to Whalefest. I haven't been here before, but I've been in this community from UC Santa Cruz, starting with my graduate student work 20 years ago, through sort of a bunch of different ways of seeing this issue of sound in the ocean. If you've heard about this topic, I'm guessing probably sonar, military sonar might be something that you've heard about, or offshore oil and gas exploration or pile driving or things like that. And I've kind of had a chance to work on those issues and other parts of the issue from like kind of a pretty unique kind of all sides of the story perspective. So I came from UC Santa Cruz. I did my Ph.D., my master's and my Ph.D. there. And I'll mention some of the work that UC Santa Cruz has on how we study hearing, how we measure the hearing and hearing impacts of noise on marine mammals. So I started kind of from a captive setting with animals that are in that kind of environment, like a laboratory environment. Morphed into some of the kind of tagging work and field studies that I'll talk about. But I have this academic background. I'm still affiliated with UC Santa Cruz and the Duke Marine Lab, as well as Oregon State University. So I teach. I have students. I publish in scientific journals. I've published about over 100 papers. So I have this kind of academic background that I'm still sort of quasi-academic in a way. I just don't work for a university per se. But I had this phase in the middle of my career where I worked for NOAA. So I was in Washington, D.C. At a time when the issue of the sonar issue was really coming to a head. So there were Supreme Court cases about this issue. There was a Supreme Court case that came out of a bunch of litigation. I was an expert declarant for the government on that at a time when I didn't agree with all the things the government was saying and doing necessarily. So it was a whole interesting perspective being a part of seeing the litigation aspect of it, partially because that issue was being litigated at that level. It had a very high degree of visibility in the agencies and in the agency NOAA that I worked for, as well as in the rest of the government. So when I was there, I led, it's a little hard to see, but that middle panel, if you just see a bunch of logos at the bottom, it's DOD, it's NOAA, it's the National Science Foundation. There's 12 other agencies. We developed a federal research strategy for a decade for ocean noise that went up through, we briefed the science advisor to the president. I mean, it was like pretty high level kind of visibility. We briefed John Kerry and Olympia Snow, and the issue really kind of came to a head in DC at a time when I was there at a pretty young age. So it was a real formative kind of thing, but it gave me, insight into the challenges that people in government face having to make decisions on an issue that has incomplete science and other pressures that are factoring into decision making. So I left the government. And I kind of came back into the research field in two ways. One, through the academic partnerships that I had, but I also started a small business called Southall Environmental Associates. So for 10 years, my wife Kristen and I, who is here, have run a small business. We've got about 10 employees now, and we've successfully operated a small business in a field with funding that goes up and down for a while, and that's had a lot of positive things, some challenging kind of aspects, but I sort of, I've worked with offshore oil and gas to try to help them do some things better. More recently, I've kind of morphed into working with other forms of offshore energy like wind, and we're going to see things on our coast more like hydrokinetics. There's a bunch of things in Oregon that are using tidal energy and the energy of waves, which have different issues, but some of them associated with sound impacts. And then recently we formed this nonprofit, a new nonprofit called California Ocean Alliance that I'm really proud to be a part of, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of our research and especially these education programs that we have done. So I partially say this as an introduction, but I'm going to make some points about the need for partnerships and the need for multidisciplinary sort of teams to work on things, especially on issues that are complex. And so I say that coming from the fact that I've been, I think, on sort of all different angles of looking at this issue. Okay, so big picture kind of perspective here. Sound is really important in the ocean. It's central to what animals that live in the ocean do, much in the way that I think it's probably fair to say they use sound the way we use light. The way you perceive the world visually is how they do it. On a good day in Hawaii, you could see 100 feet, maybe 200 feet somewhere really good. You can hear a sound. There was a question yesterday about how far away can you hear a whale. With some of the systems that I've worked on with the Navy, we can track individual calling whales 1,000 miles away. Okay, so you're talking about a very different perspective. Size is, the spatial perspective is totally different. And so it's not to say that animals like whales and dolphins and fish, don't see or that they don't smell. Bowhead whales can smell really well. They don't have a sense of touch, they do. Those things are important, but sound is disproportionately important just because of the physics of the environment. It's dark, it's mixed up, it favors the acoustic channel. And people figured this out too. Yeah, of course.
Okay, so we have instrumentation that can record sound from 1,000 or hear that 1,000 miles away. But are the whales equipped to hear it that far away as well?
It's a good question. The question was, do whales pay attention to each other 1,000 miles away? It's kind of hard to know that. We do know that whales will hear sounds that aggregate them. So if you hear like humpbacks whales sometimes will respond to the slaps on the water, and we know that whales can respond to those tens of miles away. There's enough, I think, indication that some of these aggregations, some of the displays of male large whales, blue whales, to where females are on the order of tens or hundreds of miles. So it's a little hard to tease apart, but we know the signals are there. We know the whales, are making things that can be heard a long way away. Okay, so people have sort of converged on this same fact, right? We don't use radar underwater the way that we do in air because electromagnetic radiation doesn't work the same way underwater. We have sonar systems to communicate things in underwater modems and sonar to active sonar to locate submerged objects. So we either make sound on purpose for things like sonar systems to map things, or incidentally to what we're doing. So a ship going from point A to point B, just like a big truck, is putting sound into the ocean. And so the key questions that I've spent a lot of my life asking are, we can also use the acoustic channel to find out important things like where are whales and when are they there? And we'll give some specific examples of that. Can we understand things about where they're distributed and how they behave just from listening to the environment? Yes, absolutely. But we know there are impacts. Some of the focusing events that have made people care about this issue have been really high-level things like stranding events where there are dead animals on the beach, which are bad. But there are some sublethal kinds of things that we're increasingly more aware of, like, and I'll go through some of those, but interference with communication or disturbance from breeding areas or feeding areas that may be important but not lethal. So what are those kinds of impacts? And then here's the hard part: what can we do to try to minimize those things? quieting technologies, time, space, area kind of restrictions. And so that gets into the hard part. So I'll try to kind of build up to some of that a little bit. This is just kind of another way of looking at the issue, and I partially mention this because it's in the current issue of Physics Today, and it's written by a woman named Megan McKenna, who we're very lucky to have back in our community here. She worked for the National Park Service. But this is kind of the best kind of depiction of the different components of what we call acoustic ecology, how animals use and are sort of influenced by the acoustic environment. So we have, the sensory capabilities that process the information that we have, and how those hearing capabilities influence how animals perceive things is important to understand, to predict which kind of animals are going to be impacted by things. What are sounds used for? That sort of can give us some indication about the types of effects we might see and their severity. What other things are there in the acoustic environment? Because we've often thought about these impacts like they're sort of occurring in a vacuum, but the ocean is a dynamic kind of environment. And so all of these kinds of things kind of make up the ways we address that question by studying how animals hear, what they're exposed to, why they're using sound, how they behave. And I'll kind of touch hopefully on a bunch of these things in some ways. But I wanted to start with just some sounds, right? We're talking about acoustics here. So these are some sounds that you would likely hear here in Monterey Bay. I'll start with whales because we're Whalefest, but I'm going to give you some seal sounds too. So I'll just play these guys. So this is probably really familiar too, right? Humpback whales use this very complex, and I was talking with someone today who's a musician. Their themes and phrases and it is a musical environment and a musical life that these animals really largely lead. Okay, so we could go on with humpbacks forever, but I'll skip to some more. And I love humpback sound. It's amazing. Okay, but even from this, you'll just between the two species I'm going to play here, you'll see some differences. So the humpbacks have a lot of this kind of modulation. There's a lot of variety in them. Some other animals that we hear here in the bay, like fin whales, are a little bit simpler. And sometimes, I'll spend some time in this talk talking about frequency and spectra, and by that I mean think of sound like a keyboard. And the whales are playing the left notes all the way over here, and the dolphins are playing the right notes all the way over here, and the humpbacks are kind of going all over the place. The fin whales are playing one or two notes down on the bottom. But that idea of a spectrum as a keyboard, I think, is a good visualization to think about this aspect of where are you on the piano. Because we want to talk about conservation and impacts, it sort of matters where you are on the piano. If you're on these notes, you're going to be messing with these animals potentially, and if you're over here, conversely. So I think that's kind of hopefully a useful analogy. But some of them, like these fin whales that are all the way down here, they're so low it's almost hard to hear them. So we have to speed them up because we hear they've got a whole octave. They have notes off of your keyboard, and the dolphins and the porpoises have notes off the other end of your keyboard. So when we listen to those, we got to kind of bring them into the middle a little bit here. So I'll play it first at 1 time speed, a fin whale call. And even with this other speaker here, it's got a little bit better low frequency. It's still pretty hard to hear. So here's the same sound sped up 2 times. A little bit simpler of a sound than the humpbacks. But really important. These animals are using these sounds for important social functions. Okay, you probably recognize the dolphins. So our odontocetes, these are whistles and squeaks and things that they're using to communicate with one another. They basically have 2 different types of sounds. These kinds of social sounds that are more sort of tonal and frequency modulated. Again, these are kind of like 2/3 of the way up the keyboard. Now, if we go all the way higher and we look at something like a really deep diving animal, like a beaked whale, and all of our odontocetes use echolocation clicks. Now we're all the way off the keyboard on this side. We have to slow it down. So if we slow this down by a third speed, we have something that sounds like this. Hear that little click? And it's really interesting the way that it's produced. It's like if you open the animal's head, it's like there's a little, you know how you can take a balloon and kind of let a little bit out and just kind of create like a squeak or a little pulse. They basically have these little lips in their head, and they're moving air back and forth and creating these clicks. But it's how they look for things. It's how they find things. It's sort of like they're swimming around, turning a flashlight on, looking over there, and then when they see something, they turn the flashlight on and focus on it. So we hear those types of sounds, the social sounds and the clicks from odontocetes. Now I'm going to play you two sounds quickly that from animals that don't occur in Monterey Bay, but I'm partially just trying to sort of illustrate the diversity of sounds that we hear in the environment, in the ocean environment. Where did my cursor go? Okay. Sorry. Sort of losing it here. Whoops. Oh man, gotta get our walrus sound in. Can't quite see it. The cursor kind of went away. Oh, there we go. Thanks. Thank you. Walrus make crazy sounds, and there's people that are studying the mechanics of how it works. You can almost hear it like it's a drum, and there's this sort of drumming thing going on, which is really cool. And then I got to tell you, I love whale sound, but you go to Antarctica and you hear animals like leopard seals and Weddell seals, and it's like going to space. So a lot of our Arctic animals make very diverse sounds like this, but I could just listen to this all day. These are just some of the most diverse sounds in the world. Okay, so anyway, I just wanted to give you some examples of, yes? Yes. It depends on the environment. If you're walking on ice, you can hear the sounds of Weddell seals and leopard seals coming through the ice. So that actually transmits up into the ice. But tens of miles, they're not as loud as like an animal like a blue whale. So part of how far things carry also depends on where you are on that spectrum. So the really low frequencies go a long way. The really high frequencies don't. So even if you make a loud sound at high frequency, it doesn't travel as far. So yeah, something like tens of miles. I just wanted to put this up briefly. If you're interested in sound in the ocean and you want to hear a whole bunch of different kinds of sounds, there's a website called Discovery of Sound in the Sea, which is fantastic. It's very scientifically sort of organized, but it's done at like a technical level and then kind of like a general public kind of open and very accessible level. Okay. So part of why I gave that sort of diversity, and I didn't even really give you any examples of human sounds, is that it is a complex acoustic soundscape is another term that we use, like landscape, that has natural sounds like lightning and waves and rain on the surface of the ocean, and people sounds from a whole bunch of different sources, like, as I mentioned, ships and pile driving and the animals themselves. So these things are sort of interacting in a pretty complex environment, a complex acoustic environment. And if we look at like what can these things do to animals, what are the concerns that we have, what are the types of impacts that we see, and I put these in order of sort of increasingly bad but decreasingly common, or vice versa, increasingly severe but decreasingly occurring. So in a lot of instances, sort of like if you're here and someone's talking in the other part of the room. You can hear them. It's part of the background, but nothing. There's no kind of. It's not like all sound is bad for marine mammals, just like for people. But the probably the most common thing we could get into are things that might impede their communication. And here again, think of that keyboard. If you're playing the same notes, and you could do this experiment for yourself if you have a piano, you make a note. You could play notes that are far away from that as loud as you want, and you can still hear the sound. It's the way our ears work. It filters things out into different frequencies. So that interference really depends on if you're a whale, ship noise is a problem. If you're a dolphin, it's actually not a problem. The ships being around may have other issues, but you can hear over something that's really different. When it overlaps, that's when there's an issue with things like masking. As sounds get a little bit louder, we see things like temporary or permanent hearing loss, which is rare, but can occur at louder sounds. A lot of the work I've been doing recently is looking at behavioral responses, so sublethal kinds of things like, are there changes in vocal behavior? Is there an avoidance response? Is there a cessation of something important like feeding? And we're getting better at sort of quantifying some of those things. Physiological effects. You have stress responses to noise in your environment in animals, just like you do in people. People that live in cities have physiological stress associated with that constant sort of disturbance of which noise is a part. We're starting to measure that in some of these studies where we can look at things like cortisol levels for animals that are exposed to noise. And then strandings are kind of the extreme end of it. And that really drove the issue for a long time. That's what people were aware of with this issue. But as we've really gotten into the last 2 or 3 decades, but really in the last couple decades, really some focused studies, we're realizing some of these sublethal things are much more common, and they, over the course of a whole population, they may be more important than these rare but lethal events. They're all important considerations, but so that's kind of the whole spectrum of things. So when I went to DC and started working on this issue, and I was kind of like an advisor to the policy people that were developing regulations for ocean noise. And at that time, and I'm talking 2003, 4 through 2010, really, the up until about 10 years ago, there was really this very simple kind of way of thinking about it. One was you have a level of sound, and below that level there's no problem, and above that level there's always a problem. Those levels are symmetrical isopleths in the ocean, and you have something that might harm an animal or something that might disturb an animal. Those things roughly in our law equate to level A and level B harassment under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. That's how these things were sort of implemented. And it seems almost a little crazy now to think about this because, and even at the time I think people knew this was overly simplistic, but now we realize, these things, there aren't thresholds in nature. Some animals are more sensitive than others. Some animals may be, more likely to respond at certain levels. And, just looking at it, the ocean environment isn't simple. There are no isopleths. So this is a picture that shows you how loud the sound is from a source that's all the way on the left of the range at about 200 meters. So if you took a sound, red is loud, blue is quiet. You took a sound and put it at 250 meters, and then you measured how that sound travels through the environment. There are places where you could be up near the surface and have that sound barely be audible a mile away and have it be 50 dB louder, and dBs are exponential, 5 times as loud to your perception 25 miles away. So there you have to kind of realize that the complexity of the ocean environment is part of this, and we have to take those things into account. But the other thing I would say about these thresholds that we sort of started to address first is there's no difference based on frequency. So think of that piano, 160 dB down on these notes is something that a whale could hear really clearly, but a dolphin might not hear at all. So that idea wasn't in the guidance, it wasn't in the regulatory thought process at all. And I had a chance to, when I was in, and I mentioned Long Marine Lab, that's a picture of the Marine Lab there, and a picture of a harbor seal inside what looks like kind of a soundproof room that we can measure its hearing in. And the basic idea is just like with the kid where you have the headphones and like raise your hand, except they have little flippers, so we have them push on a paddle with their nose. But you do that a whole bunch of times with some kind of controls, and you get these pictures of what we call an audiogram. It's like a depiction of how well they could hear. And the bottom axis of that is frequency. It's just like the keyboards. So 10 is way down here, 100,000 is way up here. We can hear between about 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. And this shows the lower the point on that curve, the better the animals can hear. So you have a window where they can hear better, and we can look at things like aerial versus underwater hearing. But using these kinds of measurements to measure hearing, we can start to put animals into the categories that they more appropriately go into based on this, where you are on the keyboard. So that was a totally new concept. And the curves that are on here, there was actually more than this in this. So in 2007, there were about a dozen people, and I kind of got coerced into leading this group, partially because I worked for the regulatory agency that needed guidance. They had this 160, 180 simple thing, and they wanted a kind of better scientific basis for it. So we published this paper, and the red curve is the whales, the blue curves are the dolphins and the porpoises, and they're pretty similar to one another. But basically, it's sort of showing, it's like that audiogram flipped upside down. The whales are more sensitive the further you are left on the piano, and the other ones further to the right. And we could basically use those to say, if you have a sound that falls inside one of these things near the top, the animals could perceive it the same. But outside of those, you have to account for those differences in estimating hearing differences and hearing impacts. And that paper was pretty unique. This hadn't been done, not only for marine mammals, hadn't been done for any non-human species to develop these acoustic guidances for quantifying noise impacts. Last year, we published another, like an update, a revised version of it, and I will not go into the details of it. It's pretty complicated, but I will just say there are now 9 functions. So we've got low frequency whales, we've got very low frequency whales, we've got 2 different types of dolphins, we've split the seals and sea lions up. But now we can not only take those filters, it's like a lens. You know, these animals are seeing through a lens, an acoustic lens, and we've got things matched to the different species. And then we can take those curves and flip them back over and say, if there's a sound at this level, at this frequency, we predict that would harm the hearing of this particular species. So I spent a lot of time working on these 2 things. They're now the basis of the acoustic guidance for NOAA for the US. And they've been adopted in a couple dozen countries because people are sort of looking to how the US is developing these things. So, you know, I think we're seeing, you know, some of these measurements came from Santa Cruz here, how you take that kind of science and put it into a decision-making, policy-making perspective. But one other thing that it's really making us realize too is for many of these species, there are some examples. Harbor porpoises are really sensitive species. We don't know these things. We don't have blue whales in laboratories, so you're dealing with trying to predict things and extrapolate things. So there's some caveats and some cautions and some sort of things to try to be more conservative when you don't know that are built into this. But for many of the species we do know pretty well, we're realizing the sounds that it takes to actually, they're fairly resilient from an auditory perspective, and it's sort of driving us more towards really thinking about the behavioral and physiological effects in some ways. So yesterday, Will, who's going to talk in a minute, and a number of other Hopkins students spent some time, James is here. People have done a lot of work with tags, And some of I've done a fair amount of work on behavioral response studies where we've put tags on whales and we can track what kind of sounds they hear, how they move, how they dive, how their foraging behavior changes. And there's a whole series of papers that we did on blue whales, and I'll just briefly say, let's see, So this is depth. And this is a track of a blue whale's diving before, during, and after an exposure to what's a simulation of military sonar. So this experiment was, we were trying to measure how are blue whales impacted by Navy sonar. They haven't been part of stranding events before, but there's some important things we care about, like does it change their feeding or calling? And we found some interesting things. One of them is, in this instance, the whale continued kind of diving the way it was diving before. This is a measurement of its speed, and it didn't leave the area where it was. On the other hand, another whale, as soon as the sound came on, before it was even audible, before we could even pick it up out of the background noise, had a pretty unusual dive profile here, sped up and moved away from where it was. It was pretty short. I mean, with the animal, it was a short experiment. The animal resumed what it was doing soon thereafter. But we see these big differences. So within that same species, in one instance, there's a sound, and think about that 160 threshold level. It makes, for this animal, here's an animal that was exposed to 160 dB, which is pretty loud, and continued doing what it was doing, and another animal that responded at 80 dB, which is a huge difference. So we're realizing, just like people, it matters what you're doing at the time. So this animal was feeding at the surface on a highly concentrated prey that was there and it didn't want to leave it. The other animal was just traveling through the area and probably was just like, I'm going this way, like you might cross the street if there was something, but if you were in a restaurant, it was noisy, you stay there. So this context dependency is really an important thing. We're realizing that things like spatial proximity, and if you put a sound in front of an animal, it may be more likely to move away from it, independently of the level of the sound itself. So there's a whole big story behind that I won't go into, but I'll just say we're realizing these context dependencies, and they're enabled by the technology of having these kinds of advanced tags. And then the last thing I'll say about some of these behavioral response studies is there's been a whole bunch of work that's come out because of them and because of the development of these tags on basic aspects of how animals behave, like a calling fin whale. Can we identify that was that individual calling fin whale, which is really important if you want to say, I hear a bunch of calls from a fin whale. How many fin whales are there? If you know that a fin whale calls once every 5 minutes and you hear 500 calls, you can say, we think maybe there's 10 animals, as opposed to maybe there's one calling 500 times or 500 animals. So it helps with some practical things about just understanding these animals. So there's a huge amount of work being done on really cool aspects of tags. The folks from Hopkins gave a great talk yesterday, and you should check out Jeremy Goldbogen's lab for some more of that. Oh, whoops, that's just kind of a visual. These tags are pretty much like the guts of them are like the size of a cell phone, and they're placed with suction cups non-invasively on the back of whales. And I'm not going to say anything more about behavioral response studies with tags. And the only reason I put this up is this project has a huge number. There were 40 publications that came out of this 8-year project that we did to measure military sonar. But the other reason I wanted to put this slide up is look at all the logos. And if I were to go through those logos, I would say there's nonprofit research organizations, there's government, there's private companies, there's research labs, there's people from different countries. So these kinds of studies, these issues where we're looking at trying to understand acoustics, behavior, noise exposure, noise propagation, they require these multidisciplinary, multi-institutional teams. And I think when I'm going to sort of switch to sort of our local issues here, and you'll see some of these same types of teams, but to address these kinds of issues, we need multiple institutions and multiple partners. Very briefly, We've also developed some ways to look at groups of dolphins and other cetaceans where we're not able to tag an individual. We're not placing a sensor on one animal. And I think about this like if you've seen common dolphins in a group, you know, the group is the unit of analysis. The animals, it's like a flock of birds. If you put one tag on a bird, you wouldn't really get a picture of what the flock of birds is doing. So we've kind of tried to address that for some of these species that people have, you know, in the Navy sort of always assumed like, hey, there's a lot of them. They're out there. We see them. Sometimes they bow right on ships. Like they're not affected. But no one's ever measured the behavioral responses of animals like common dolphins and bottlenose dolphins to military sonar. If you look in the Navy's applications for impacts of sonar, it's millions of animals. It's millions of impacts that are predicted without a direct measurement. So anyway, we got into this to try to inform, you know, how are these animals? Are they affected, and how are they affected? So it's a really interesting integration of some existing things. So there's people standing on shore looking through binoculars and theodolites. There's a drone with a camera on it that's looking straight down. There's listening sensors placed in the water so we can hear what's going on. And then afterwards, we're taking tissue samples with biopsies to look at physiological effects. So if we kind of get tracks like this that are tracks of the whole group and how that group moves over time. From the photogrammetry, we can actually get tracks of individuals once a second. We can track every animal, where it's oriented in space, how it's spaced, if they're all linear or not, how the flock changes. We also get some amazing pictures. That's a photo ID quality picture of a rhesus dolphin taken from a UAS. We can get measurements of group vocal changes, and if the animals respond vocally, which many of them do when you play sonar to them. And we can start to get into the physiological components. How does the cortisol in the blood change as a function, in the blubber, change as a function of sound exposure? And we've measured some discernible physiological changes. That's important because if you don't see a behavioral change, but animals are really motivated to stay somewhere, you could still be having impacts. And a lot of the times we've kind of made this assumption like, if you don't see them leave, there's no problem. But there are other things sometimes going on. Okay, I'm going to switch to, and I'm going to go a little rapid fire through this because I'm going to transition over. But part of what I'm going to transition over to Will on is this hydrophone system that the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute put out a couple of years ago. And I'll show you a map in just a second of exactly where it is, but it's on the seafloor. It's listening all the time. You can go online and hear it yourself. It's awesome. Warning, like half the time there's not much going on because that's just the reality of the ocean, but you can hear, I go on it when there's storms and stuff, but you hear all sorts of stuff on it. I like it because it is an open, accessible, civilian, real-time acoustic system, and there's not a lot of them. I've worked with Navy systems that do amazing things, but other people can't hear it and can't use it for science. So John Ryan is the key person on this. He's a key collaborator of mine. So that system is part of a new program called Characterizing Soundscapes in National Marine Sanctuaries. And there's actually a West Coast component of it that includes the Olympic Coast and the Channel Islands, as well as Monterey Bay. There's an East Coast part with 2 sanctuaries, and then there's some things in Hawaii. But if we look close to home here, that's Mars. That's the site in the middle of the bay. There's a site out here that the Naval Postgrad School has been developing or has had sounds on for a long time. And then there's 2 new recorders that are kind of at the north edge of the canyon and then down by where we are here. So we now have these different recorders in different locations of the bay. I'm not going to say anything really in detail about cruise ships. That is a current issue, but there's this hydrophone right here is pretty uniquely positioned to listen to the transits of cruise ships coming in. So the Naval Postgraduate School and MBAR, and within this team, which I'm working on, we're looking at these periods when the cruise ships come in and comparing how loud they are versus how loud when they're not there. And that was part of, there's a tiny little thing down there that but I will say that on the City of Monterey website, there's still a video link to a whole forum that was on cruise ships, and Acoustics was a part of that, but they kind of dealt with all of the issues of cruise ships, which I won't go into. I'll just say we have some new ways of looking at the impacts of that on the acoustic environment. One other thing that is happening locally here that people I think didn't really realize a lot was going on are seal bombs. And these are basically, it's like an M80. It's a firecracker kind of size thing that fishermen are allowed to put into the water to deter animals from taking their prey, taking their fish. I'll briefly play what this sounds like. It's an explosion. But now let me ask you this: like, if we were here in Monterey and someone lit off an M80 in the parking lot, do you think you could hear it in Santa Cruz? Probably not, but if we set one of these off just offshore here, you could hear it in Santa Cruz. The scale of the acoustic environment underwater is really different. So just to be aware of it, this is a little hard to see, but John, Ryan, they've basically, maybe the thing to pay attention to here is this is the number of counts over different months within the year, and there are months where there are thousands of these things detected in Monterey Bay, more so in the summer months. They're associated with the squid fishery. But Karen Forney and Ann Simonis from NOAA are looking at our harbor porpoise population, which basically is limited between Pigeon Point and just below Point Sur, mostly in these shallow areas here. Harbor porpoises are really sensitive. They're sensitive. Their hearing is sensitive. Their behavior is sensitive. And it's a new issue that we're aware of and that people are working to try to kind of understand what the potential impacts are. Oh, whoops. Okay, I got one last sort of sciencey thing here, and then I'm going to sort of switch into this new section and talk about sort of inspiring the next generation. Peggy talked about entanglement, and I'm not going to get into all of the great things that people are doing to sort of deal with entanglement as it occurs. Some of the work that the passive acoustics and especially some of these new directional sensors are offering is things that may be useful to understand the susceptibility of animals to entanglement by identifying seasonal patterns and spatial patterns of where animals are. So there's a lot going on the entanglement issue. I'm not saying that acoustics is going to necessarily solve that, but it may give us a better way of understanding seasonally when animals are present using some of these tools, and especially if we can start to localize them. And the folks at NPS are working on some of that. The other sort of issue that we're working on through COA is realizing that there's actually probably more risk of ship strikes in Monterey Bay and more actual ship strikes in Monterey Bay than people have sort of thought of. That's been an issue that's been focused around the ports of LA, Long Beach, and Oakland, San Francisco, because you have these ships coming into areas where they're highly concentrated, where whales are. But there was a paper by Cotton Rockwood and John Kalmakidis recently that sort of modeled the risk of ship strikes. And if you look in some of these areas around Monterey Bay, there's a pretty high probability of risk because the lanes go basically over the shelf where a lot of whales live. We just don't see it here. We don't see those strikes like you would if it happens in San Francisco Harbor where the whale is going to be located. So anyway, we're working on using some of these acoustic sensors to identify habitats, and John's been doing some work from some of the modeling. Just to kind of put a point on it, the predicted mortality of blue whales, the potential biological removal is 2, and the total mortality is between 18 and 40 modeled along the California coast. So this is definitely an issue, and it's an issue locally, even though we don't necessarily think about ship strikes in Monterey Bay. Okay, a lot of what I've been working on through COA is with a number of our people is to try and inspire the next generation to teach and to engage young people in how we do some of this kind of work. And we sort of are working in a bunch of different areas. I'm going to talk mainly about the Marine Mammal Science and Training program. I mentioned the Ship Strike Initiative. There's some work that Carolyn Casey, who is here, is doing on bioacoustics of elephant seals. But I want to tell you just briefly about this program because it's pretty new. It's something that I really believe in. We're taking high school kids and putting them on the water, showing them how it's really a methods class. It's how we do marine mammal research. We take them, and maybe I'll cut to this program with some of the elements of it. It's kind of unique because the kids are interacting directly with the people who are the heads of laboratories that are people that are top in their field kind of research, doing hands-on sort of intensive work with a small number of students. It sort of spans taxa. There's work with pinnipeds. There's work with whales. We work both in the lab at Long Marine Lab, as well as we take the kids out on the bay. We put them on kayaks. We put them on boats and show them how we do this stuff directly. And it sort of helps us inspire these kids, but we don't sort of stop there. There's a number of them that we've written letters for them for college. There's a couple of them that have gone to colleges that are now working on papers with us. So it's a real engaging kind of a project. And if I go through sort of some of the things that we do there, there's a day we take them on the bay, and we're putting tags out, and there's tagged humpback whales, and the kids, now we were very careful to kind of deal with all of our permit requirements. They're on a boat. There are experts that are doing the tagging. It's part of ongoing research projects. But the kids, once the animals are tagged, the kids learn how we track them, how to use VHF antennas, how we use photo ID, how the tag data is analyzed, how passive acoustics data is analyzed. We take them to the Marine Lab and show them how some of the hearing work with and physiological work with captive animals is done. They get to participate in a necropsy, so these kids get their hands dirty, literally. We teach them methods of using GPS to track animals and do sightings. We work the sea otter conservation program at the aquarium and also take them to the Marine Mammal Center. So there's some more information about the program here. Carolyn Casey, who runs it, is here. It's a week at a time. It's not cheap to put this program on, so we've kind of asked kids that are able to donate. But last year we gave almost half of it was scholarships. We reached out to schools with communities that maybe aren't necessarily normally represented, and try to get women and minority students involved. So we give full and partial scholarships. So there's some more information there. Anyway, it's a great program and something that we're happy to be involved in. Okay, I probably talked too long, but I'm going to ask Will to come up now. Will Ostrike is a student at Hopkins, and I wanted to kind of end with the next generation by giving it to the next generation. We work closely with Will, and what he's going to tell you briefly about is a good example of this multidisciplinary partnership, and it has to do with blue whales and acoustics in Monterey Bay. So Will, why don't you come on up, and I will switch over and you can take it from there. And then thanks for sticking with us. I'll let Will talk, and then I'll just give one little wrap up at the end.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. My name's Will Ostrike, and like Brandon mentioned, I've been working with a lot of the groups that Brandon talked about collaborating around the Bay. In particular, the COA, the California Ocean Alliance, that Brandon talked about starting recently, has supported some of the field work for my Ph.D. studies at Hopkins Marine Station. And I'm going to be talking to you about some of the things we've learned from that field work and this collaborative effort with other people, including folks from Stanford, Santa Cruz, Moss Landing, MBAR, and elsewhere, as you can see here. So I often, when I'm talking about this research, I often start with that picture of the blue whale's tail fluke going up, because I think that's often about the most that we ever see of a blue whale out here in the ocean. And it makes it really hard to learn things about their behavior just visually. And a lot of the reason for that is because their home habitat is what you're looking at here. Habitat that's so large you can see it from space. It's also habitats that's really, really dynamic and highly variable, as you can see the patterns of plankton blooms that are captured by our Earth-observing satellites. So we're right here in Monterey Bay right now, and we're very lucky that for a good chunk of the year we have blue whales around in Monterey Bay and some of the areas north and south of here along the west coast of North America feeding. These animals are well known to migrate southward to Baja California and areas off of the west coast of Costa Rica, where they breed and where they spend their winters. But to study these animals that are living some sort of complex, long lives that have these potentially really interesting behaviors that we can't really see above the water using our eyes, we have to use a whole combination of methods and new technologies to study the behaviors of these animals. So I'll be talking about two different types of methods to study behavior that occur at two totally fundamentally different scales. And for one, we want to study these animals at the regional level and the populations of these animals, how they change their behavior day to day, month to month, year to year. And to do that, we use acoustics, like Brandon has been talking about today. In particular, I work closely with folks like Brandon and John Ryan, who was mentioned earlier, at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institution. And we use this passive acoustic monitoring system on the seafloor of Monterey Bay, right in the middle of the sanctuary, that's been running from July of 2015 to the present to monitor what these animals are doing using acoustics. But to provide context for what sounds we're hearing on that acoustic stream and that live stream that you all can listen to that Brandon mentioned, we use tags to study the behaviors that are associated with different types of sounds that we hear. So Brandon mentioned earlier some of the difficulties that come with studying really, really loud whales in the ocean and what is associated with different sounds. One of those issues is knowing who's making a sound when it's so loud and you've got a group of animals in a small area. And to do that, we use a method that was pioneered by my Ph.D. supervisor, Jeremy Goldbogen, who's been discussed a lot this weekend, where we use the accelerometers that are on these tags that measure vibrations to determine which of these calls that we're hearing on the tags are coming from the animal that actually has the tag on it. So you can see this blue whale in Monterey Bay here that has the little yellow tag on its back, and when it makes certain types of really low frequency calls, like ones I'll show you in a minute, it actually vibrates the tag so violently that we can see those vibrations in the data that comes off of those tags, and then line it up with the other data streams from these tags to say what these animals might be doing right before, during, and after these calls that they produce. So we have four main call types that blue whales make in this part of the world, in the Northeast Pacific Ocean, where we live, and I'll play some examples for you here. The graph that you're seeing here is a visual representation of sound. So as Brandon talked about, kind of that keyboard of different frequencies that sounds are produced at the high end of the y-axis there, we have higher frequency sounds, and at the low end, we have these lower frequency low notes on the keyboard over time, and colored by the intensity of energy at that frequency or time. So first I'll play this A call for you that you can see here. And you can hear the pulses of energy there, these almost like this metronome-like quality to that call type, and you can see those pulses of energy represented in the spectrogram there as you have it light up in these pulses. Next I'll play the B call, which is their strongest and clearest call, as you can see by those really bright colors on the spectrogram. And finally, I'll play the D call for you, which you can see actually covers a broader frequency range, so you'll hear the change in pitch of that sound. pretty amazing to hear these animals making these sounds. And again, like Brandon mentioned, I would recommend that you all check out that live audio feed from MBAR where you can hear these things happening in real time right out here in the sanctuary. I'll be, for the rest of this talk, focusing on one call type in particular, and it's that B call, partially because it's one of the clearest signals and one of the easiest for us to detect, but also because it's the call type that these animals make most frequently, and one that's associated with song, which is a type of vocal behavior that's thought to be exclusive to males and may have important behavioral functions related to territoriality or mating. So some of the findings, I'm gonna trouble you guys with some graphs here, but bear with me. Some of the findings that we've been able to put together working with the team from MBAR and elsewhere in the Bay is kind of this average sort of seasonal pattern of what blue whales are doing here in Monterey Bay. And that's what you're seeing here on the top panel, that rise and fall of the intensity of blue whale song that we hear here in Monterey Bay. You can see the peak is kind of in October or November, rising to that peak throughout the summer and then dissipating in December and perhaps early January. Something that you'll notice on the bottom of this panel is that the time of day that these animals produce this song changes throughout that cycle as well. You can see that as that signal is rising in the summer, the majority of that signal is actually happening at night. And as you reach the peak and then these animals leave the area and the intensity of blue whale song dissipates, you see that the difference between day and night in the bottom there actually becomes pretty much indistinguishable. And these, again, are all findings from that passive acoustic monitoring, listening on the seafloor. So this really big difference between day and night while these animals are coming into the area in the summer is something that we were really interested in. What drives that, and what are we hearing behaviorally when we hear these differences between day and night? And that's where we've turned to those tag technologies that have been discussed. So here you can see, as Brandon was describing earlier, what we call a dive profile from one of these tags. And you can see in the black line the diving behavior of this blue whale that was tagged in 2017 in Monterey Bay. And you can see all of these blue dots are every time that this animal fed. And you'll notice that during the day, these animals tend to dive quite deep in the water column, searching for concentrations of krill, and they're feeding really intensively. But you'll notice that as we have the sunset and shift into night, this animal also shifts its behavior and starts singing near the surface and doesn't really feed at all during the night. And that's, by tagging many of these whales and observing this pattern repeatedly, we've been able to establish that that big difference that we see in the amount of song that's being produced at night versus day is a result of these animals feeding. So really, when you're hearing calling at night but not during the day, it's a behavioral signature. You're hearing feeding animals. But what about that time of the year where there is not this difference between day and night? How does that look acoustically and from a tags perspective? Luckily, we've had collaborators at Cascadia Research Collective, including John Calamakitis, who's mentioned earlier, and James Fallbush, who's a fellow Ph.D. student at Hopkins Marine Station, that have developed these really amazing tags that can stay on these animals a little bit longer. So we're able to tag an animal and then observe its behavior over the course of weeks, and in this case of this animal from 2018, over the course of over a month. So this animal was tagged up north, pretty close to San Francisco, actually, and you can see in the top panel of this graph that it migrated south over the course of that month that the tag was on. But what you'll also notice is that about 9 days into this deployment, as shown on the second panel here, this animal stopped feeding entirely. And for the final 3 weeks, we didn't observe this animal feeding once. At the same time, you'll notice that on the bottom panel, and it's a little hard to see here, but the time of day that this animal was singing changed a lot whenever that feeding behavior stopped. So this animal started calling much, much more during the daytime as soon as it stopped feeding. So if we go back to that sort of seasonal understanding of the behavior and presence of blue whales in Monterey Bay, you can see that as they're leaving the area at a population level, we also are hearing no difference between the amount of song produced in the day versus the night. So now we have a second acoustic behavioral signature that when you're not hearing this day-night difference, you're likely hearing an animal that's migrating and not feeding. Again, just to emphasize that daytime bias seems to be indicative of that feeding behavior. So what have we learned from this big collaborative study involving multiple tag types and this long-term acoustic array and all of these people working throughout the Bay? For one, we've learned that we can link these technologies that operate at fundamentally different scales to learn things about behaviors of these animals, which I think is really exciting considering that until relatively recently, the only way we were able to study their behavior was like in this picture, getting visual information about them. Second, we were able to establish that there are these distinct acoustic signatures that relate not just to these animals being present, but that give us information about what they're doing when we're hearing them. And finally, as Brandon has kind of alluded to throughout his talk, having real-time feeds of behavioral information about an endangered species like a blue whale could be really valuable for making decisions about how to spatially manage our oceans. So if you're hearing in real time that you have animals feeding or migrating by a certain area, that could be really, really useful information if you want to mitigate things like ship strikes that Brandon talked about. So I'll just end by again thanking all of the collaborators that I'm lucky enough to get to work with on all of this, and the funding sources including several foundations, government funding, and of course COA, as Brandon mentioned. And then I'll pass it back over to Brandon.
Okay, I know we're just a little bit over time, so I'm going to make this really short. I'm just going to make some very last points, and then I think Will and I can stay up here and take any questions that people have up here. But just, I thought it was important to kind of give you the next generation, right? These are the people that we need. We need to inspire and enable and empower students of this. But if I were to kind of give you just a wrap up of the whole thing, sound is critical to these animals. It's how they live. We can have a range of effects on them. What is happening at the time is really important. These kinds of new technologies, you're seeing things that we didn't even think were feasible 10 years ago, and that's a lot of it's through new technology. We need these multidisciplinary partnerships, like Will mentioned, and again, we do need the next generation. And I think a lot of people here are doing things with students and engaging students and enabling them to be part of things, and that's really important. And the final point I'll make is we have to have some hope. Those of us that work on conservation issues it's like, you get it from all sides with climate change and entanglements and marine debris and overfishing, but like, we have to realize that some of these things we can change and we can make better. Noise is a bit of a unique one because it's not like pesticides or, carbon dioxide. Once you turn it off, it actually goes away. It's an ephemeral one. So it's important to remember that there are things we can do, and not everything is lost, but people are creative, youth is resilient, and we can't be too downtrodden about things. We can make some change. So thank you guys for sticking till the end, and we'll take any questions up here if people want to come up. Great, thanks.